Eastern Europe is borrowing money from China at a pace that makes it near impossible to pay back. Multiple nations are already deep in debt to the communist government in China after borrowing money, most of it for infrastructure. The main problem comes from the banks in Europe refusing to fund smaller nations in Eastern Europe because they estimate that they might not be able to pay back the money anytime soon. China doesn't have the same fears. They actually count on these nations not paying back, so they fall into a debt trap with China. A debt trap that China uses all over the world to gain more influence and control. In the South China Sea, many smaller nations have already given up huge parts of infrastructure and land to China when they can't pay back these loans. Same thing is happening all across Africa and South America, and now China is beginning to do the same with Eastern Europe as well. The pattern used by China banks is the same they use everywhere else. Typically, it starts with a nation in need of money for infrastructure. China's major banks like Exim Bank of China then steps in with loans that no other banks in the West can compete with or won't because the risk is just too high for them. When these nations then can't pay back the money, China will demand payment in form of infrastructure or land. So this doesn't happen by coincidence. It's a long-term coordinated attempt for China to get a foothold in Europe, something they call the 17+1 initiative, which again is part of China's overall Belt and Road Initiative. The 17+1 initiative refers to China working with all of the countries in Eastern Europe and was started very recently in 2012 in Warsaw, with annual summits after that. These meetings have the stated goal to promote China's Belt and Road Initiative and create closer ties between China and Eastern Europe through, quote, growing ties in the areas of culture, education and tourism, cultural exchanges, think tanks and NGOs. Which sounds very good, but most often this initiative is not a matter of culture, education or tourism. It's more a platform for China to hand out huge loans to all of these countries in the region. Almost all of the Eastern European countries are participating in these summits. The only nation to leave since its founding is Lithuania, but the rest are still actively creating closer ties with China almost exclusively through loans. The most recent deal that has been struck was between Ukraine and China. This surprised a lot of countries because Ukraine would normally rather turn to Europe. Now, this deal is about Ukrainian infrastructure, roads, railroads, bridges, and so on. But Ukraine will be working with a Chinese company that has been blacklisted by some countries, including the United States, because of their CCP government ties. By carrying out this deal, Ukraine is running the risk of pushback from their Western allies. So these Western allies are criticizing Ukraine, but they still aren't willing to actually help out Ukraine themselves. China, on the other hand, has encouraged Ukraine to sever their dependence on the West. Quote, if Kiev can recognize the situation and get rid of the country's dependence on the West, the prospect of China-Ukraine cooperation are good. This statement reflects the overall attitude China has to Europe. They hope to persuade Eastern Europe that the rest of Europe is holding them back, trying to prevent them from doing these very cheap loans with China. And you could say that in a practical way, China is right, but what they forget to mention is that one by one, these nations that loan money from China fall deeply into debt with them as well. Montenegro is a similar case in that they've been working with the same Chinese companies but now have found themselves to be unable to pay back the huge debt that has been building up. Montenegro owes more than $1 billion to the Exim Bank of China alone, and that is almost 20% of the national GDP. And as payment, they were actually about to give up infrastructure to that bank and thereby China, but in the last moment banks from France and the US stepped in. They had to offer Montenegro an interest rate of just 1% to beat the deal Montenegro had with the Chinese bank. Now that's a great deal for Montenegro, but it shows you why banks in the West have a hard time bailing out loans from these Chinese banks. their interest rates are just too low. The EU is becoming aware of what's happening to their member nations, but the power of these cheap loans from China leaves the EU almost powerless to counteract these deals as long as the individual nations keep taking them. So to counter this, the EU has been hoping for the US banks to step in. But the problem is that the US banks themselves owe China a lot of money, and the US government owe China trillions of dollars. All of that makes banks and politicians in the US very, let's say, hesitant to step in and help Eastern Europe. Part of the problem lies with the EU itself. Recently, the EU has sanctioned a lot of these nations in the 17+1 initiative. These sanctions typically come after disagreements like the one about the much debated LGBT issue in Hungary. The problem with these sanctions against nations like Hungary is that it leaves them with precious few options. The sanctions create a distrust to the EU, and every time a member nation in Eastern Europe has a conflict with the EU, China stands ready to offer a deal that will relieve the nation of the pain from these sanctions. The sanctions might have had a legitimate reason to begin with, but they often end up with the unintended consequence of pushing countries like Hungary into the arms of China. So if you're Hungary, then you have little option but to take these deals with China, and most of the time they do it happily because the deals are just that good. This cycle of countries in Europe being pushed into the arms of China has been happening more and more over the last 8 years since the founding of the 17+1 initiative, and if not handled correctly soon, there just might be no way to stop China from getting a permanent foothold in Europe. A foothold that has them practically taking over parts of nations just like they are in the rest of the world right now. The EU needs to find a way to embrace these countries better and do what they can to not push them away from European deals. Almost all of these deals with China are regarding infrastructure like roads, buildings, and so on. So the best way to stop this from happening is to find a way for Eastern Europe to catch up with the rest of Europe developmentally, or the problem will keep growing and China will keep taking over more and more.